It's like in the Beatles, we had Pete Best, who was a really good drummer, but there just was something, he wasn't quite like the rest of us.
If, when we do the next session, I mean, I don't want to interfere with the Beatles and what you're doing with them, that's fine, but I'm going to provide the drummer.
We really started to think we needed the great drummer in Liverpool.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
So definitely the most controversial thing about Beatles history is, why was Pete Best replaced by Ringo? And as you've seen from other videos that we've done, it seems to provoke quite a large debate. Now, if you want to know what starts it all, then watch this video, which is all about the audition that the Beatles did with George Martin. That's what starts everything, and that will crop up as we go through. If you want to know why he wasn't fired, then watch this video as well. This will tell you the legal aspects of what actually happened and how they got rid of Pete. But you've just seen a couple of clips from John, Paul and George. But let's dig deeper into the reasons why. Now, some people were quite happy with, let's listen to one comment from one of the Beatles, and I'm happy, that's all I need to know. What I want to do is, with all the research I've done over the years, I've tried to compile every comment, every aspect that I could find from John, Paul and George as to why they made the change. So let's look at John Lennon to start with. Okay, so John has got this quite outspoken thing on Pete, and he's very dismissive of Pete's talent. And this is what John said.
By then we were pretty sick of Pete Best too, because he was a lousy drummer, you know. He never improved, you know. And there was always this myth being built up over the years that he was great and Paul was jealous of him because he was pretty and all that crap, you know. And the reason he got in the group in the first place was because the only way we could get to Hamburg, we had to have a drummer. And we just heard that this guy was, we knew of this guy who was living at his mother's house who had a club in it, and he had a drum kit, and we just grabbed him, auditioned him, and he could keep one beat going for long enough, so we took him to Germany. And we were always going to dump him when we could find a decent drummer, you know. But by the time we'd got brought back from Germany, we'd trained him to keep a stick going up and down and four in the bar. He couldn't do much else, you know. And he looked nice, and the girls liked him, so, you know, that was all right.
So John wasn't mincing his words there, was he, at all? But then, in an interview with Tony Barrow, who did a lot of the PR with the Beatles, he did the sleeve notes for the records, etc., John had said to him, Pete was a great drummer, but Ringo was a great Beatle. Now, this is something others have said to me over time. Alistair Taylor, Brian's PA, had said the same thing. You know, he got on very well with Pete, and again, felt he was a really great drummer, but just Ringo fitted better in. He was a better Beatle. Whatever that means, that's what they felt. So, again, different points of view there. But then John also said, this myth built up over the years that he was great and Paul was jealous of him because he was pretty and all that crap. They didn't get on that much together, but it was partly because Pete was a bit slow. He was a harmless guy. But then you add into the mix this interview with John when he was talking about the Beatles.
We were four guys that I met Paul and said, do you want to join my band, you know? And then George joined, and then Ringo joined. We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all. You know? And sometimes our best work was never recorded, you know.
Why?
Because we were performers, in spite of what Mick says about us, in Liverpool, Hamburg, and around the dance halls, you know. And what we generated was fantastic when we played straight rock. And there was nobody to touch us in Britain, you know. But as soon as we made it. The edges were knocked off. You know, Brian put us in suits and all that, and we made it very, very big, but we sold out, you know. And the music was dead before we even went on the theatre tour of Britain.
And as he said, their best work was never recorded. Their best, pardon the pun, was when they were in Liverpool and Hamburg playing straight rock, which was as John, Paul, George and Pete. So he's obviously got strong feelings about the music they were playing, how great it was back then, before then Brian puts them into the suits. So again, it's just trying to get a balanced view. Now, let's now look at Paul. This is from a documentary that Paul did called Wingspan, and he was looking back at one of the drummers in Wings, but he then brought up this interesting comment about Pete.
It's like in the Beatles, we had Pete Best, who was a really good drummer, but there just was something. He wasn't quite like the rest of us. We had kind of a sense of humour in common, and he was nearly in with it all. But it's a fine line, you know, as to what is exactly in and what is nearly in. So he left the band.
So Paul's obviously of the opinion that Pete was a really good drummer. He also went on to say in a different interview, and we've discussed this one before, but Paul said, George Martin took us to one side and said, I'm really unhappy with the drummer. Would you consider changing him? We said, no, we can't. It was one of those terrible things you go through as kids. Can we betray him? No, but our career was on the line. Now, actually, I think we're pretty sure from what George Martin has told us that George Martin spoke to Brian. Brian then spoke to John, Paul and George. George Martin didn't actually speak to the Beatles individually. But Paul's put into context there the actual decision. He goes on to make the most important point, I think, in all this, which is our career was on the line. Maybe they were going to cancel our contract. It was a big issue at the time how we dumped Pete. And I do feel sorry for him because of what he could have been onto. But as far as we were concerned, it was strictly a professional decision. If he wasn't up to the mark, slightly in our eyes, and definitely in the producer's eyes, then there was no choice. But it was still very difficult. It's one of the most difficult things we ever had to do. Now, if you want to check that one out, that's in the anthology. So Paul, again, is saying it's a professional decision. And this is the one that I can really understand. These three young lads, it's their very last chance of getting a record deal. And if George Martin's got question marks about the drummer, then you can understand them saying, well, this is our last chance. If we don't get the contract, the Beatles are finished. If we do get the contract and the producer doesn't like Pete, then he's going to have to go. So you can understand where Paul's coming from with that one. Again, in the anthology, when Paul was talking about Pete, he says, you know, he was a good drummer. And when Hamburg came up, he joined us. He was a very good looking guy. And out of all the people in our group, the girls used to go for Pete. But then Paul has also then gone on to say, what's the truth about why Pete Best was sacked? Because George Martin wouldn't have him is one good reason, and Ringo was better was the other prime reason. So again, looking back, Paul is, as he often does, when he's looking back at Beatles history, he's saying, well, in hindsight, Ringo was the better choice. And that's what I think most people can say. And, you know, I would always say the book that I did, Finding the Fourth Beatle, was all about how they eventually go through all the drummers and they end up with Ringo. And why Ringo was the right choice. And why nobody else could have done what Ringo did. So please don't ever think that I'm trying to dismiss Ringo or his ability, because I'm not. I'm a huge, huge Ringo fan. Just want to make that one nice and clear. Next, we move on to George Harrison. Now, writing back to his best friend Arthur Kelly from Hamburg in 1960, George wrote these words. We have Pete Best, Mrs. Best's little lad, with us from Casbah fame, and he is drumming good. So things were obviously going okay at that point. George was quite happy. And the Beatles became the biggest band in Hamburg, the biggest band in Liverpool. They get Brian as their manager, they get the record contract. So he was doing something right. But then George also then said this in the anthology.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
I'm sorry, but I've watched that so many times and I still don't understand what George is talking about. I know he feels, looking back, it was the right decision. Just as Paul was saying, and as we can all see. But Ringo wasn't always going to be in the band. It happened to work out that way, and it worked out for the best. But then George makes the comment in the anthology book also that he'd become very good friends with Ringo early in 1962. I mean, Paul and John knew Ringo and they got on well with him and stuff, but it was George that developed this really good friendship with him. And this is what George says. I was quite responsible for stirring things up. I conspired to get Ringo in for good. I talked to John and Paul until they came round to the idea. So George is trying to say that it wasn't an obvious choice, but he was pro-Ringo. And he was proved right, as we now know. But John and Paul had to be convinced. Now, as we know, there were other drummers approached. Bobby Graham, Richie Galvin and Johnny Hutchinson. So I know a lot of other drummers were also considered, but it was 4 drummers in total who were approached. Ringo was the guy who said yes. And as I've said before, it wouldn't have worked with anybody else in the same way at all. So what does Ringo remember? This is what he said in Anthology.
It was a Wednesday and Brian called. I don't remember John calling though. It's in somebody's book. Would you join the band? And I said, what do you mean? He said, no, really join the band. And I said, sure, yeah, when? And he said, now. And I said, no, I can't do that. Because we've got these other 4 guys here. We've got a gig for months, and, I can't just pull out now and it'd all end. So I said, I'll join you Saturday. Because we used to have Saturday off, because that's when they used to change the campers. So I gave Rory Thursday, Friday, Saturday to bring someone in, because to open again on Sunday, which I thought was giving them a hell of a lot of time. And that was it. We played the Cavern. There was a lot of fighting and shouting. Half of them hated me, half of them loved me.
There was a few people there who were shouting, Ringo never, Pete Best forever. And after about half an hour, I said, oh, bugger off, or something. And stepped out of this, the Cavern had this, it was 3 tunnels. And we stepped out of what was the dressing room into this dark tunnel, and some guy just butted me right in the eye. That was a bad day. And then I walked under a bus, got hit by a double-deck bus.
George fought for me.
So the way Ringo remembers it is that Brian offered him the job on the Wednesday. And he said, I've got to give Rory lots of time. The afternoon he gave him until Saturday, which wasn't a great amount of time. Rory Storm was not impressed at all. Though, as we now know, we're pretty sure the phone call from Brian to Ringo was on the Tuesday, which is the day before Brian then had that meeting with Pete. So let's look back at what George Martin was saying. He was quite clear of what had happened after the audition on the 6th of June 1962.
And we did a reasonable audition, not very good, but the thing he didn't like was our drummer.
And I said to Brian Epstein, when we do the next session, I don't want to interfere with the Beatles and what you're doing with them, that's fine, but I'm going to provide the drummer.
And George Martin made another quote, and this is in the Beatles Encyclopedia. And this is what he said. I never suggested that Pete must go. All I said was that for the purposes of the Beatles' first record, I would rather use a session man. I never thought that Brian Epstein would let him go. He seemed to be the most saleable commodity as far as looks went. It was a surprise when I learned that they had dropped Pete. The drums were important to me for a record, but they didn't matter much otherwise. Fans don't pay attention to the quality of the drumming. So this was in response to Pete being kicked out and Mona Best managing to get hold of George Martin and have a conversation. And that's what he said. So that's why on the 4th of September, when John, Paul and George walk into EMI Studios with Ringo, George Martin was really surprised. He thought, who's this guy? Because nobody had told him that they'd changed the drummers. He wasn't expecting that at all. So George Martin wasn't looking for Brian to replace Pete. He was just going to use a session drummer, which was normal practice back then. Of course, Brian didn't know that. He wasn't in the recording business. He was in the record retail business. One of the other observers there was Norman Smith, who of course worked with the Beatles on a number of their recordings. He was an engineer on the 6th of June, 62. And also, outside of his recording business, he was also a drummer. This is what Norman Smith said about Pete.
These guys, to me, were special right from the very time I met them. And their personality hit me, Took George a little time to get used to it, because George Martin, anyway, he wasn't used to that kind of rock group, call it that. Anyway, as you may know, the type of records that he made. I'm very good at it, of course, at that, but he wasn't that interested in guitar groups, you know, playing that. I can understand his lack of enthusiasm to begin with, as I've said, because they didn't show anything at the audition. But it, of course, then wasn't long before it, particularly, I mean, Love Me Do was not a great hit. We had a bit of a struggle. George didn't actually come to the first recording of Love Me Do. His assistant came, and Ron Richards, and myself. So we were left to Love Me Do, the first record. It wasn't terribly successful, not because of our fault, but because it just wasn't happening, you know, and particularly Ron thought, and later George, because of Pete Best, his drumming. But I still say it wasn't that. It wasn't a decent arrangement. He was a decent enough drummer. It wasn't that at all. This is solely my opinion, that you know, it was mainly down to what he was playing and not how he was playing.
So Norman didn't see a problem with Pete's drumming. It was what they were playing. It was the arrangement of Love Me Do. And that arrangement, as we know from that recording, where they tried to put this, what's called the skip beat in, is something the Beatles had come up with quite recently while they were out in Hamburg, just to try and liven the song up a little bit. And it didn't work, but there must have been enough in that audition for them to hear that version and think, okay, we can work with that. Because that went down from the large list of songs down to only 4 they were looking to record. So there must have been something in it. They thought, okay, this is good for a run through. There's some possibility that could make a record. So we've gone through the list. There's a balance there. But overall, there's enough there which is saying that Pete was a good drummer. Now, we know from reputation, I've spoken to so many Merseybeat musicians here who said that Pete was a really good drummer. They had no problem with that. And as I've mentioned before, I've played in groups with drummers over the last 40 more years. You know very, very quickly, if you're in a group and the drummer can't drum, then you find out within 1 or 2 hours. It doesn't take you 2 years. Now, I've played with drummers then who can play drums and can keep a tempo, but they're not particularly good. They can't do much more than that. Well, again, you find that out quite quickly. You do not spend hundreds of hours on stage for 2 years traveling around creating this amazing sound and then suddenly go, oh, hang on a sec, I think our drummer can't play drums. So that on its own doesn't make sense as a reason. The only evidence that there is, without getting all revisionist from the Beatles mythology, the only evidence is what George Martin said on the 6th of June. Backed up then by what Paul McCartney had said, it was strictly a business decision. Pete was a really good drummer, but if there was a problem for the producer, this was the last chance of making the record, getting the contract, then they had to make that change. At that point, they then think, okay, can we do it? Well, yes, let's justify it. And if you think about it, going back, John, Paul and George were together from 1957 in the Quarrymen. So they've been together all the way through. Drummers had come and gone. Other musicians had come and gone. The Beatles, up to that point, was always going to be about that threesome. And as Ringo had said, it took him 12 months just to break in and to be accepted by John, Paul and George. But he did it. So they have mentioned they could have done it better. And they could. They could have sorted all of this out back in 1962. But they didn't, so it's rumbled on. Pete was a really good drummer. But George Martin had raised concerns. And once those question marks were there, they thought, we've got to make the change. And they did. So, for me, let's give Pete Best credit for those 2 years that he spent with the Beatles. Because without him, as Alan Williams once told me, there would have been no Beatles. In those 2 years, they went from a nothing group to being the best in Liverpool and Hamburg. And as I mentioned, of getting Brian Epstein as manager and getting the recording contract with George Martin, it just meant that Pete wasn't going to be on the great train ride that was going to be their recording career. And that was going to be Ringo. And Ringo was the best person for the job. So John, Paul, George and Ringo, we're not looking to change history. We're just looking to examine history and get the history right. That's all. So the way I look at it, when Pete Best left the Beatles in August '62, that was the end of the Beatles. They were a great rock band. They played American covers. They played some great rock and roll. But it was time for a change. As Ringo joins, that's the birth of a brand new group, the Fab Four. And they were going to be recording original material. They're going to be a pop group. They were going to go on and change the world forever. But it was a different group. So we give credit to Pete for those 2 years. And please, let's give credit to Ringo. He wasn't just a lucky guy in the right place at the right time. He earned his right to be there. And by the end of their recording career, they could not have done the same with any other drummer apart from Ringo. So, put your comments below. Tell me what you think. But this is what the Beatles and their entourage have said about the situation. You make your own conclusions. I've told you mine. See you at the next video. Thank you.